The wind howled through the thin walls of the trailer, carrying with it the bite of another harsh winter approaching the Colorado Rockies. 16-year-old Marcus Webb pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders as he watched his father cough into his fist again, the sound rattling through his chest like stones in a tin can. "Narrator, we'll freeze here, son." Those were the words his father had spoken 3 nights ago, sitting at their small kitchen table, the propane heater sputtering its last gasps of warmth. Marcus hadn't wanted to believe it then, but now, looking at the frost already forming on the inside of their windows in early October, he knew it was true. Their trailer, perched on a small plot of inherited land at the base of Mount Elbert, was falling apart. The heating system had given out last spring, and they'd barely made it through on space heaters and blankets. But winter in the mountains didn't forgive, and this year promised to be brutal. Marcus had dropped out of school 6 months earlier when his father's construction injury made working impossible. Now, at 16, he was the man of the house, taking odd jobs in town, fixing fences, clearing brush, anything that paid cash. But it was never enough. His mother had left when he was 8, unable to handle the isolation of mountain life and his father's drinking problem, which had gotten worse before it got better. Now, sober for 3 years, Thomas Webb was a different man, but the damage to his back and their finances was done. The boy walked outside into the grey morning, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Their dog, a mixed breed named Rusty, with copper-coloured fur and one ear that flopped forward, bounded up to him with the eternal optimism that only dogs possess. Marcus knelt down and scratched behind the animal's ears. "Marcus, at least you're warm, buddy. That coat of yours is better than anything I've got." Rusty licked his face, and despite everything, Marcus smiled. The dog had shown up 2 years ago, half-starved and limping, and they'd nursed him back to health. Since then, Rusty had been his constant companion, following him everywhere, sleeping at the foot of his bed, and somehow always knowing when Marcus needed comfort. From inside the trailer, his father called out, "Thomas, Marcus, come in here for a minute." The boy stepped back inside, Rusty following at his heels. His father sat at the table, spreading out a hand-drawn map on the worn surface. Thomas Webb was only 42, but he looked 60, his face weathered by sun and hardship, his hands gnarled from years of hard labor. "Thomas, I've been thinking about your grandfather's old cabin, the one up on the northern ridge." "Marcus, the one that's mostly fallen down? Dad, that thing is barely standing." "Thomas, exactly, but the bones are good. Solid log construction built back in 1953 when your grandfather first came out here to prospect. If we could fix it up before the heavy snows come, we'd have a real shelter. Thick walls, a stone fireplace that actually works, and it's positioned in a spot that gets protection from the worst winds." Marcus studied the map, tracing the route up the mountain with his finger. It was a hard climb, at least 5 miles from where they were, through rough terrain. "Marcus, Dad, you can barely walk from here to the truck. How are you going to help me rebuild a cabin?" "Thomas, I can't, but you can. I'll tell you what to do, and you've got strong hands and a good head on your shoulders. Your grandfather taught me how to work with wood when I was your age, and I taught you. We've got most of the tools we need, and the cabin's got the foundation and frame. We just need to patch the roof, fix the walls, and get that fireplace working again." "Narrator, what about money for supplies?" "Thomas, that's the thing. Your grandfather left some timber stored in a small shed up there under tarps. If it's still good, we might have what we need. And there's a stream nearby for water. We'd be off-grid, but we'd be warm and safe." Marcus looked at his father's face, saw the desperation there mixed with something else, hope maybe, or just the last gasp of a man trying to protect his son. "Marcus, when do we start?" "Thomas, tomorrow I'll drive you up as far as the logging road goes, and you and Rusty will hike in. Take the backpack with basic tools and some supplies. Scout it out, see what we're working with. If it looks doable, we'll make a plan." That night, Marcus lay awake in his small room, listening to the wind shake their trailer. Fear gnawed at his stomach. He'd never done anything like this before. Sure, he could fix a fence or patch a roof, but rebuilding an entire cabin in the mountains, alone with winter coming? It seemed impossible, yet what choice did they have? The alternative was freezing or worse, ending up in some shelter in Denver, separated from his father, losing the only home and land they had left. The next morning arrived cold and grey. Marcus packed his grandfather's old external frame backpack with tools, rope, a tarp, dried food, water bottles, matches, and a sleeping bag. His father added a worn notebook. "Thomas, this was your grandfather's journal from when he built the place. He wrote down everything, measurements, techniques, problems he ran into. It might help." Marcus took the journal, feeling its weight in his hands. He'd never known his grandfather, James Webb, who died before Marcus was born, but he'd heard the stories. A stubborn, resourceful man who'd come west after World War II, looking for gold and silver, never finding much, but building a life in these mountains anyway. The drive up the old logging road took 40 minutes, the truck bouncing over ruts and rocks. When they reached the end of the passable road, Thomas stopped and turned to his son. "Thomas, Marcus, I know this is asking a lot. If it's too much, if you get up there and it's not doable, you come right back, you hear me? I won't have you risking yourself for a broken-down cabin." "Marcus, I'll be careful, Dad, I promise." "Thomas, and son, I'm proud of you. You've become a better man than I ever was at your age. Hell, better than I am now." "Marcus, Dad, don't." "Thomas, I mean it. Now get going before I get all emotional like your grandmother used to." Marcus shouldered the heavy pack, checked that his knife was on his belt, and whistled for Rusty. The dog bounded out of the truck bed, tail wagging, ready for adventure. Together, they started up the trail, an old mining path that switchbacked up the mountainside through pine and aspen forests. The hike was brutal. The pack dug into Marcus's shoulders, and the altitude made his lungs burn. But Rusty led the way with enthusiasm, stopping occasionally to look back and make sure his human was following. After 3 hours of steady climbing, they emerged into a small clearing on a ridge, and there it was, the cabin. It was worse than Marcus had imagined. The roof had partially caved in on one side, exposing the interior to the elements. Several logs in the walls had rotted through, leaving gaps. The door hung crooked on one hinge. The single window was broken. But his father had been right about one thing. The basic structure was solid. The foundation stones were still in place, and most of the log walls were intact. The stone chimney stood straight and strong. Marcus dropped his pack and sat on a large rock, suddenly overwhelmed. How was he supposed to fix this? He was just a kid. He didn't know enough. He didn't have enough supplies. This was insane. Rusty nudged his hand with his nose, whining softly. "Marcus, I know, boy, we've got to try." He pulled out his grandfather's journal and began to read. The entries were methodical, detailed accounts of each day's work during the cabin's construction. James Webb's handwriting was neat and precise, his notes filled with measurements and sketches. Marcus found himself drawn into the words, feeling a connection to this man he'd never met, who'd faced these same mountains with nothing but determination and skill. As the sun began to sink lower, Marcus made his decision. He'd stay the night, start working in the morning, and see how far he could get. He cleared out the least damaged corner of the cabin, spread his tarp on the floor, and rolled out his sleeping bag. There was no way to build a fire in the fireplace until he'd inspected the chimney, so he ate a cold meal of jerky and crackers, sharing pieces with Rusty. That first night on the mountain was the longest of Marcus's life. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset, and every sound made him jump. Branches cracking, animals moving through the underbrush, the wind moaning through the damaged roof. He'd never felt so alone, so small against the vast indifference of nature. Rusty pressed close against him in the sleeping bag, the dog's warmth and steady breathing the only comfort in the darkness. But when dawn came, something shifted in Marcus. He'd made it through the night. He was still here. And the morning light revealed the mountain's beauty, the way the sun caught the peaks, the crystal clarity of the air, the absolute silence broken only by birdsong. For the first time in months, he felt something other than fear and worry. He felt possibility. The work began. Marcus spent the first 2 days just assessing the damage and clearing debris. He used his grandfather's journal as a guide, checking each log, testing each joint, examining the roof structure. The timber his father had mentioned was there, in a small shed 30 yards from the cabin, and miraculously it was still good, kept dry under layers of old tarps and the shed's intact roof. He developed a routine: wake at dawn, work until noon, take a brief rest and eat, work until the light began to fail, prepare a cold meal, read from the journal by flashlight, sleep. Rusty was always nearby, sometimes disappearing to explore or chase squirrels, but always returning before dark. The physical labor was crushing. His hands developed blisters that burst and became calluses. His shoulders ached from carrying logs. His back screamed from bending and lifting. But slowly, incrementally, the cabin began to take shape. He replaced the rotted logs one at a time, using techniques his grandfather had detailed in the journal. He patched gaps with moss and mud, the way mountain builders had done for generations. The first major challenge came on day 4, when Marcus realized one entire wall section needed to be completely rebuilt. 3 logs had rotted through from water damage, compromising the structural integrity. His grandfather's journal had detailed instructions for log replacement, but reading about it and actually doing it were vastly different things. Marcus stood staring at the wall, overwhelmed by the complexity of the task. Each log was notched and fitted precisely to interlock with the ones above and below. Removing the damaged logs without causing the entire wall to collapse required careful planning and temporary supports. He spent hours studying the journal entries, sketching out his approach, measuring and remeasuring. The removal process took an entire day. Marcus used wedges and a jack to carefully lift the upper logs, inserting temporary supports as he worked. Rusty watched from a safe distance, occasionally whining with concern when Marcus grunted with effort or cursed under his breath. By evening, the damaged logs were out, leaving a gaping hole in the wall that made the cabin look even more hopeless than before. "Marcus, what am I doing, Rusty? Look at this mess. I've made it worse." But the dog simply wagged his tail, trusting that his human knew what he was doing, even when Marcus himself had no such confidence. That trust, simple and unquestioning, gave Marcus the push he needed to continue. The next 3 days were spent preparing replacement logs. He had to select timber from the shed that matched the dimensions of the originals, strip the bark, cut the logs to length, and carve the notches that would allow them to interlock properly. His grandfather's journal included detailed sketches of the notch patterns, but translating those drawings into actual cuts in solid wood required patience and precision Marcus wasn't sure he possessed. He made mistakes. The first notch he carved was too deep, weakening the log. The second was angled wrong and wouldn't fit properly. By the third attempt, his hands were raw and bleeding, wrapped in strips torn from an old shirt. But he was learning, understanding through failure how the pieces had to come together. "Marcus, Grandpa, I hope you're watching this. I'm trying to do it the way you would have." On day 8, he finally fitted the first replacement log into place. It slid into position with a satisfying solidity that made his heart leap. By day 10, all 3 logs were replaced. The wall was solid again, and Marcus felt a surge of accomplishment unlike anything he'd experienced before. He'd solved a complex problem, learned a difficult skill, and created something that would last. But the victories were mixed with setbacks. On day 12, a sudden afternoon storm caught him on the roof, and he slipped on the wet wood, falling 8 feet to the ground. He landed hard on his side, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. For several terrifying moments, he couldn't breathe, couldn't move, convinced he'd broken something vital. Rusty was there instantly, licking his face, whining frantically. Slowly, painfully, Marcus rolled onto his hands and knees, testing each limb. Nothing was broken, but his ribs ached fiercely, and a deep bruise was already forming along his left side. He sat in the rain, shaking from shock and fear, while Rusty pressed against him. "Marcus, I could have died, boy. I could have broken my neck, and Dad wouldn't even know for days." The incident shook him badly. That night, huddled in his sleeping bag with his ribs throbbing, Marcus seriously considered abandoning the project. It was too dangerous. He was too inexperienced. What was he trying to prove? But as he lay there listening to the rain drum on the damaged roof, he thought about his father, alone in the failing trailer, depending on Marcus to succeed. He thought about the alternative, homelessness, separation, the end of everything they had. By morning, the fear had transformed into determination. He would be more careful, but he wouldn't quit. He couldn't quit. The work continued. Marcus learned to read the weather, to recognize the signs of approaching storms in the cloud formations and wind shifts. He learned which trees provided the straightest wood, which tools worked best for different tasks, how to pace himself to avoid exhaustion. The journal became his Bible, and his grandfather's voice seemed to speak through the carefully written instructions. One entry particularly resonated with Marcus. His grandfather had written it after a week of setbacks and frustration. Journal entry, October 15th, 1953. "Today I wanted to quit. My hands are so blistered I can barely hold the tools. My back feels like it's breaking. The roof section I spent 3 days on collapsed last night in the wind. I sat in the rain this morning and cried like a child, but then I remembered why I came here. I came to build something with my own hands, to prove to myself that I was more than the scared soldier who came home from the war. This cabin isn't just shelter. It's proof that I can create instead of destroy, that I can build a life on my own terms. Tomorrow, I'll start on the roof again, and the day after that, I'll keep going. Because a man isn't measured by his failures, but by how many times he gets back up." Marcus read that entry 3 times, his throat tight with emotion. His grandfather had felt exactly what he was feeling now. The fear, the doubt, the overwhelming sense of being inadequate for the task. But James Webb had persevered, and the cabin he'd built had stood for 70 years. That legacy was worth honoring, worth fighting for. The days blended together in a rhythm of work, rest, and incremental progress. Marcus's body adapted to the demands, his muscles growing stronger, his movements becoming more efficient. He learned to work smart rather than just hard, using leverage and proper technique to conserve energy. The cabin slowly transformed from a wreck into something resembling a real structure. By the end of the 3rd week, Marcus had replaced all the damaged logs, sealed the major gaps in the walls, and begun serious work on the roof. This was the most critical part, the difference between having shelter and having a decorated box that would fill with snow. The existing roof structure was partially collapsed, but the main beams were still solid. He needed to reinforce them, add new rafters, and then layer on the roofing materials. Working on the roof was terrifying after his fall, but Marcus forced himself to overcome the fear. He moved carefully, always maintaining 3 points of contact, never rushing, constantly aware of his footing. Rusty would lie at the base of the ladder, watching anxiously whenever Marcus climbed up. It was during one of these roofwork sessions that Harold first appeared. Marcus was balanced on a rafter, hammering in a support beam, when Rusty suddenly barked. Marcus looked down to see an old man standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him with an expression of surprise and respect. "Marcus, can I help you?" "Harold, you're doing fine all by yourself, looks like. I'm Harold Cassidy. I've got a cabin about 2 miles east. Saw smoke from your fire a few nights back and got curious. Haven't seen anyone up here in years." Marcus climbed down carefully, his heart pounding from the unexpected interruption. "Marcus Webb, this was my grandfather's place." Harold's entire demeanor changed at the name. "Harold, James Webb's grandson. Well, I'll be damned. Jimmy and I were good friends back in the day. Heard he'd passed. Must be 15 years ago now. You're rebuilding his cabin." "Marcus, trying to. It's slow going." Harold walked around the structure, examining Marcus's work with a critical eye. Marcus held his breath, waiting for criticism, for someone to confirm what he already feared, that he was doing it all wrong. "Harold, your grandfather would be proud. You're using his techniques. I can see it in the notchwork and the way you've sealed the gaps. Not perfect, but solid, real solid for someone working alone. How old are you, son?" "Marcus, 16. "Harold, 16. Jesus Christ, and you've been up here alone doing this?" "Marcus, my dad's hurt. He can't make the climb. We need somewhere to live for the winter." Harold studied Marcus for a long moment, seeing something in the boy that made him nod slowly. "Harold, well, you've got guts, I'll give you that, but you're making some mistakes that are going to cost you time and effort. If you want, I can show you a few things, save you from learning everything the hard way." That offer changed everything. Over the next week, Harold became Marcus's teacher, showing him techniques that weren't in the journal, tricks learned from decades of mountain living. He taught Marcus how to properly seal a roof to handle heavy snow loads, how to create ventilation that wouldn't let heat escape, how to bank earth around the foundation for insulation. He was a demanding teacher, quick to point out errors, but also generous with praise when Marcus got something right. "Harold, no, you're fighting the wood. Let it tell you where it wants to go. Feel the grain, work with it, not against it." Marcus would try again and again until Harold nodded approval. The old man never did the work for him, only demonstrated and guided, making Marcus develop the skills himself. "Harold, anyone can follow instructions. A real craftsman understands why he's doing what he's doing. When you know the why, you can adapt when things don't go according to plan." They worked together during the days, but Harold always returned to his own cabin at night, giving Marcus space to process what he'd learned. Those evenings alone with Rusty, Marcus would review the day's lessons, study the journal, and feel the growing confidence that came from genuine competence. One afternoon, as they worked on installing a particularly tricky roof section, Harold asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. "Harold, why didn't your father come up here? Why send a boy to do this alone?" "Marcus, he's injured, hurt his back in a construction accident, can barely walk some days." "Harold, that's the how, not the why. A father who cares about his son doesn't send him into the mountains alone unless there's no other choice." Marcus felt defensive, but forced himself to think about the question honestly. "Marcus, we don't have options. We're broke. The trailer we're in won't make it through winter. This cabin is the only shelter we can afford, and fixing it is the only way we survive. Dad would be up here if he could, but since he can't, someone has to do it, and that someone is me." "Harold, and if you fail, if this doesn't work?" "Marcus, then we freeze or we end up in some city shelter. Dad gets taken to one place, I get sent somewhere else. We lose the land, lose everything, so I can't fail." "Harold, that's a hell of a burden for a 16-year-old. "Marcus, maybe, but it's the burden I've got." Harold was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Harold, your grandfather would understand. He carried his own burdens up here. The difference is he had a choice. You don't. That makes you either very brave or very foolish, and I haven't figured out which yet." "Marcus, does it matter? Either way, the cabin needs fixing." Harold laughed, a rough sound that seemed unused to laughter. "Harold, no, I suppose it doesn't. Now pay attention because this next part is important and I'm only going to show you once." As October wore on and the temperatures continued to drop, Marcus could feel winter approaching like a predator circling its prey. The aspen trees turned brilliant gold, then lost their leaves. The first snow dusted the peaks above them. The stream ran colder, the nights grew longer, and the urgency of completing the cabin pressed down on Marcus like a physical weight. But he was no longer working alone. Harold checked in regularly, sometimes staying for hours to help with complicated tasks, other times just dropping by to assess progress and offer guidance. The old man brought supplies occasionally, things he said he had extra of, but that Marcus suspected Harold had sacrificed from his own stores. A bag of nails, some tar paper that would make the roof more waterproof, a lantern that burned cleaner than Marcus's flashlight. "Harold, can't have Jimmy Webb's grandson freezing because he didn't have proper gear. Your grandfather saved my life once, back in '69. I got caught in a whiteout, completely lost, would have died from exposure if Jimmy hadn't found me. I owe him, which means I owe you." "Marcus, you don't owe me anything. What you're teaching me is payment enough." "Harold, teaching you is the easy part. You're the one doing the hard work. Most people your age would have quit by now, gone running back down the mountain. But you're still here, still fighting. That counts for something." Those words, simple and direct, meant more to Marcus than Harold probably realized. He'd spent so long feeling inadequate, feeling like he was failing at everything, school, work, taking care of his father. But up here, seeing the cabin take shape through his own efforts, having someone like Harold acknowledge his determination, Marcus began to see himself differently. Not as a failure or a burden, but as someone capable, someone worthy. After a week, he hiked back down to check on his father and get more supplies. Thomas had managed to gather some roofing materials from a demolition site in town, along with some salvaged windows and a used wood stove someone was throwing away. "Thomas, how's it going up there?" "Marcus, it's hard, Dad, really hard. But I think I can do it. I think we're going to make it." His father's eyes filled with tears, and he pulled Marcus into a tight hug. "Thomas, that's my boy, that's my son." Marcus spent 2 nights at the trailer, helping his father with daily tasks and gathering supplies. He noticed his father seemed stronger, more hopeful than he'd been in months. The physical therapy was helping, and having a goal, a future to work toward, had given Thomas something to fight for. "Thomas, I've been doing research on the cabin, on Grandpa's time up there. Found some old papers in the boxes we never went through. Surveys, mineral assays, claim documents. Did you know he was prospecting seriously up there for almost 20 years? "Marcus, the journal mentions his explorations, but not in much detail. He focused more on the construction and survival aspects." "Thomas, that's because the prospecting was mostly failure, but he never gave up. Even when the big strikes never came, he kept looking, kept hoping. There's something admirable about that kind of persistence." "Marcus, or stubborn?" "Thomas, same thing sometimes. You've got it too, that Webb stubbornness. It's what's keeping you on that mountain when any sensible person would have quit." The second trip up the mountain was even harder than the first, with Marcus carrying the wood stove strapped to his pack frame, piece by piece, over multiple trips. The stove had to be disassembled to make it manageable, which meant 3 separate climbs with heavy loads. Each trip took most of a day, and by the 3rd climb, Marcus's legs were trembling with exhaustion. But Harold met him halfway on the final trip, appearing out of the forest like a ghost, and helped carry the last section. "Harold, saw you struggling up here earlier. Figured you might need a hand." "Marcus, I'm not complaining." They worked together to reassemble and install the stove, a process that took the better part of 2 days. The stove needed to be positioned precisely, with proper clearance from the walls, and the stovepipe had to connect perfectly to the chimney. Harold was meticulous about the installation. Harold, a poorly installed stove is a death trap. Carbon monoxide, chimney fires, you name it. We're going to do this right, even if it takes longer. Marcus learned about draft and draw, about the importance of proper sealing, about how to maintain the stove for maximum efficiency. Harold had been heating with wood for decades and knew every trick, every potential problem, every solution. By the end of the third week, the stove was installed and the chimney cleared and repaired. That night, Marcus built his first fire inside the cabin, and the warmth that filled the small space felt like the greatest luxury he'd ever known. Rusty lay in front of the fire, his copper fur glowing in the flickering light, and Marcus felt a surge of pride. They were doing this. Against all odds, they were actually doing this. Harold had stayed for the first fire, sitting on an overturned log and watching the stove with satisfaction. "Harold, that's a good draw, no smoke backing up, heat spreading evenly. Your grandfather built that chimney to last." "Marcus, how long did you know him?" "Harold, met Jimmy in '62, not long after I came up here myself. I was running from some trouble down in Denver, nothing violent, just stupid choices and bad company. Figured the mountains might straighten me out. Jimmy found me half frozen one November, took me in, taught me how to survive up here. We became friends, the kind that don't need to talk much but understand each other anyway." "Marcus, what was he like?" "Harold, complicated, haunted by the war, Korea, though he never talked about it much. He'd have nightmares sometimes, wake up shouting, but during the day, he was the calmest man I ever knew. Patient, thoughtful, careful in everything he did. He believed in doing things right, even if it took longer. Said rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes in the mountains could kill you." "Marcus, that sounds like his journal entries." "Harold, he wrote everything down, said his memory wasn't reliable anymore, so he needed a record. But I think it was more than that. I think writing helped him make sense of things, gave him control when so much of his life had been chaos." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire, and Marcus felt a connection to his grandfather that he'd never experienced before. Through the cabin, through the journal, through Harold's memories, James Webb was becoming real to him, not just a name and some old photographs. "Harold, there's something you should know, Marcus, something your grandfather made me promise to tell his family if they ever came back up here." "Marcus, what is it?" Harold stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. "Harold, Jimmy found something up here, a mineral deposit, copper and silver, maybe some gold. He spent years documenting it, taking samples, doing surveys. Never had the money or equipment to develop it properly, but he knew it was valuable. He filed claims, kept everything legal and recorded. He always said if his family ever needed it, the information would be there in his papers." Marcus felt his heart beat faster. "Marcus, how valuable?" "Harold, hard to say without modern testing, but Jimmy thought it could be significant. The samples he showed me were high-grade ore. He marked the location on his maps, created a whole survey system. It's all documented, if you know where to look." "Marcus, why didn't he develop it himself?" "Harold, money mostly. And by the time he had some savings, he was getting older, his health wasn't good. He figured his kids or grandkids might have better opportunities. He wanted to leave them something more than memories and a run-down cabin." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. The idea of a valuable mineral deposit seemed like something from a fantasy, too good to be true. But Harold had no reason to lie, and his grandfather's meticulous documentation suggested this was real. Somewhere on this land, there might be something that could change everything. Over the next days, as he continued work on the cabin, Marcus found his mind wandering to the mine. Where was it? How much was it worth? Could it really make a difference for his father and him? But he forced himself to focus on the immediate task, The cabin had to be finished before winter. The mine, if it existed, had waited this long. It could wait a bit longer. The roof work continued through early November. Marcus and Harold worked together, creating a weatherproof barrier that could handle the heavy snow loads common in the Colorado Rockies. They layered tar paper, installed the salvaged shingles, sealed every potential leak. It was tedious, exhausting work, but absolutely critical. One afternoon, as they neared completion, the first real snow came. Not the light dustings they'd seen before, but a serious storm that dumped 6 inches in as many hours. They were forced to stop work and take shelter in the cabin, watching through the window as the world turned white. "Harold, this is early. Usually don't get snow like this until late November." "Marcus, will the roof hold?" "Harold, let's find out." They sat by the stove, drinking coffee Harold had brought, listening to the wind howl and the snow accumulate on the roof. Marcus felt his stomach clench with worry. If the roof failed now, after all this work, they'd be back to square one with winter already arriving. But the roof held. The next morning, they climbed up carefully to inspect it and found no leaks, no weak points, no problems. The snow had piled up, but the structure beneath was solid. "Harold, your grandfather engineered this well, and you've restored it properly. This cabin will stand for another 70 years if it's maintained." Over the following week, they finished the remaining work. The window was installed and sealed. The door was rehung properly, fitting snugly in its frame, with weather stripping to keep out drafts. They banked earth around the foundation for extra insulation. Marcus built simple furniture, a bed frame, a table, chairs, shelves. Harold showed him how to create a root cellar beneath the cabin floor for food storage. By early December, the cabin was essentially complete. It was crude compared to modern houses, but it was solid, functional, and most importantly, warm. The stove heated the space efficiently, the roof kept out snow and rain, the walls blocked the wind. It was a home. But as October turned to November, and the first snows began to dust the peaks above, Marcus faced new challenges. The roof was taking longer than expected, and he was running low on supplies. His food was nearly gone, and while he'd learned to fish in the nearby stream and set simple snares for rabbits, he was losing weight, his clothes hanging looser on his frame. One afternoon, as he worked on fitting a particularly stubborn log into place, his foot slipped on a patch of ice, and he fell hard, landing on his side. Pain shot through his ribs, and for several minutes he couldn't breathe. When he finally sat up, gasping, he realized how precarious his situation was. He was alone on a mountain, miles from help, with winter closing in. If he got seriously injured, if he broke a leg or worse, no one would find him in time. That night, lying in his sleeping bag with Rusty curled against him, Marcus cried for the first time since starting the project. He was exhausted, scared, and starting to doubt whether any of this was worth it. Maybe they should just leave, go to Denver, live in an apartment, let the government help them. What was he trying to prove anyway? That he was tough, that he was a man? He was still just a kid, playing at being a pioneer in a world that didn't work that way anymore. The next morning, he woke to find Rusty gone. This wasn't unusual. The dog often went exploring early, but as the hours passed and Rusty didn't return, Marcus began to worry. By noon, with still no sign of the dog, worry turned to fear. "Marcus, Rusty, here boy, Rusty!" He searched the area around the cabin, calling until his voice was hoarse. The forest remained silent. As afternoon wore into evening, Marcus sat on the cabin steps, his head in his hands. He'd lost his best friend, his only companion up here. The guilt was overwhelming. He'd brought Rusty up here into danger, into the wilderness, and now something had happened to him. Just as the last light was fading from the sky, Marcus heard barking. He leaped to his feet, following the sound to the edge of the clearing. Rusty emerged from the trees, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came an old man, tall and thin, with a long grey beard and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore worn work clothes and carried a walking stick. "Old man, this your dog?" Marcus, "Yes, sir. Is he okay?" "Old man, he's fine. Found him down by my place about 2 miles east of here. Followed me back up when he realized I was heading this way. Name's Harold Cassidy. I've got a cabin on the other side of the ridge. Been up here 37 years. Marcus Webb. This was my grandfather's cabin, James Webb." Harold's face changed, softening with recognition. "Harold, Jimmy Webb's grandson, I'll be damned. Your grandfather and I were friends, worked some claims together back in the day. Heard he'd passed. I'm sorry for your loss, though I suspect you never knew him." Marcus, "No, sir, he died before I was born." Harold looked at the cabin, taking in the repairs, the new stovepipe, the stacked timber. "Harold, you're fixing this place up yourself?" Marcus, "Trying to. My dad and I, we need somewhere to live for the winter. Our trailer down below isn't going to make it." "Harold, where's your father?" Marcus, "He hurt his back, can't make the climb, so it's just me." The old man studied Marcus for a long moment, his gaze penetrating. "Harold, you're doing this alone? How old are you, son?" Marcus, 16. "Harold, 16. Jesus, come with me." Without waiting for a response, Harold turned and started walking back toward the trees. Marcus hesitated, then grabbed his jacket and followed, Rusty bounding ahead. They walked through the forest in the gathering darkness, Harold moving with surprising speed and confidence despite his age. After 20 minutes, they emerged into another clearing, where a well-maintained cabin stood, smoke rising from its chimney, solar panels on the roof, and a neat woodpile stacked against one wall. Inside, the cabin was warm and organized, filled with books and tools, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and maps covering one wall. Harold lit an oil lamp and motioned for Marcus to sit at a solid wooden table. "Harold, when did you eat last? A real meal, I mean." Marcus, "I've been eating jerky, some fish I caught." Harold, "That's not what I asked." Marcus's stomach answered for him, growling loudly. Harold nodded and began pulling out food, bread, cheese, dried meat, apples. He set it all in front of Marcus without ceremony. "Harold, eat." Marcus didn't need to be told twice. As he ate, Harold made coffee on his wood stove, the rich smell filling the cabin. "Harold, your grandfather was one of the toughest men I ever knew. Came up here with nothing, built that cabin with his bare hands, spent 20 years looking for the big strike that never came. But he was smart about it. He knew these mountains, knew how to survive, how to thrive even. He taught me half of what I know about living up here." Marcus, "I've been reading his journal. It's like he's teaching me through his words." Harold, "That sounds like Jimmy. He always said a man who doesn't write down what he learns is a fool, because he'll forget, and then he'll have to learn it all over again. So tell me, why are you really doing this? And don't give me the simple answer. There's got to be more to it than just needing shelter." Marcus put down the bread he'd been eating, considering the question. No one had asked him that, not even his father. "Marcus, because someone has to, because my dad can't, and if I don't, we lose everything, the land, the cabin, all of it. We'll end up in some city shelter, separated probably, and that'll kill him. He's already been through so much. This is all we have left." "Harold, that's responsibility talking, that's good. But what about you? What do you want?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "Marcus, I don't know. I haven't thought about what I want. I just think about what needs to be done." "Harold, that's where you're wrong, son. If you don't know what you're working toward, what you want for yourself, you'll burn out. You'll get the cabin fixed, and then what? You'll be stuck on that mountain with no plan, no future, just surviving. Your grandfather didn't come up here just to survive. He came because he wanted something, a life on his own terms, away from the world that had chewed him up in the war. He wanted peace and purpose. What do you want?" Marcus sat silently, the question echoing in his mind. What did he want? For so long he'd only thought about survival, about getting through each day, about taking care of his father. His own desires had been pushed so far down he'd forgotten they existed. Marcus, I want to finish school someday. I want to learn how to really build things, not just fix them. I want my dad to be proud of me. And I want to stop being scared all the time. Harold, now we're getting somewhere. Being scared is normal, son. I'm 73 years old, and I still wake up some mornings scared. Scared I won't have enough wood for winter. Scared my body will give out. Scared I'll die alone up here. Fear is just information. It tells you that you're doing something that matters, something that challenges you. The trick is not to let it stop you. They talked late into the night, Harold sharing stories of his years in the mountains, the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned. He told Marcus about the harsh winter of 1988 when he'd nearly died, snowed in for 3 weeks with a broken ankle. He told him about the summer he'd found a small pocket of gold that had kept him going for 2 years. He told him about the loneliness, the beauty, the satisfaction of living by his own hands. When Marcus finally prepared to leave, Harold stopped him. Harold, it's too late and too dark. Sleep here tonight. Tomorrow I'll come back to your cabin with you. I'll help you finish the roof and show you some tricks your grandfather probably didn't write down. Then we'll talk about your long-term situation, because, son, fixing that cabin is just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Harold proved to be an invaluable teacher and ally. He was demanding, rarely offering praise, but his knowledge was comprehensive. He showed Marcus how to properly seal the roof with tar paper and shingles, how to bank the cabin's foundation with earth for insulation, how to create proper ventilation for the stove. He taught him which trees made the best firewood, how to identify and avoid areas prone to avalanche, how to read weather signs in the clouds and animal behavior. But more than the practical skills, Harold taught Marcus something else: patience. The old man worked at a deliberate pace, never rushing, always explaining why each step mattered. Harold, a job done halfway is a job that'll kill you when it fails in the middle of winter. Do it right the first time, even if it takes longer. Marcus found himself changing. The constant fear that had been his companion since his father's injury began to recede, replaced by a growing confidence. His body adapted to the work, his muscles growing stronger, his hands becoming more skilled. He learned to trust his judgment, to solve problems creatively when materials or tools weren't ideal. One afternoon, as they worked on sealing the cabin's final wall section, Harold set down his tools and looked at Marcus seriously. Harold, there's something you should know about this land. Your grandfather found something up here back in '68. A promising vein of copper and silver. Never had the equipment or money to really develop it, but he marked it on his maps. I helped him do some initial sampling. It was good ore, but the market wasn't right and the access was difficult. He always figured someone would come back to it eventually. Marcus, where is it? Harold, about a quarter-mile northwest of here, up near the cliff face. Your grandfather kept it quiet because he didn't want claim jumpers or big mining companies muscling in. He figured if his family ever needed it, the information would be in his papers. Did your father ever mention it? Marcus, no, I don't think Dad even knows. We've got boxes of Grandpa's stuff, but we never really went through it all. Harold, well, I'm mentioning it now because times have changed. Copper prices are high, and there's technology now that makes small-scale mining more feasible. I'm not saying you should run out and start digging up the mountain, but you should know what you have. Your grandfather intended it for his family. That evening, alone with Rusty in the now weather-tight cabin, Marcus thought about what Harold had said: a mineral deposit, potentially valuable, sitting unexplored for decades. It seemed like something from a story, too convenient to be real. But Harold had no reason to lie. The next morning, Marcus decided to investigate. He left early, with Rusty as always by his side, following Harold's directions toward the cliff face. The hike took 40 minutes over rough terrain, climbing through increasingly rocky ground. Near a distinctive split boulder that Harold had described, Marcus began searching for his grandfather's survey markers. He found them, small brass caps hammered into the rock, stamped with his grandfather's initials and dates from 1968. Following the markers, he discovered the entrance to a small prospect adit, partially obscured by fallen rocks and vegetation. The opening was only about 5 feet high and equally wide, shored up with old timber that still looked surprisingly solid. "Marcus, should we go in, boy?" Rusty whined, uncertain, but stayed close as Marcus cleared away some of the rocks. He pulled out his flashlight and peered inside. The tunnel extended back into the mountain, disappearing into darkness. He could see old drill holes in the rock, evidence of his grandfather's work. He didn't go far inside, aware that old mine tunnels could be dangerous, with bad air, unstable ground, and unexpected drops. But even from the entrance, he could see the glint of minerals in the rock face, veins of darker material threading through the lighter stone. Back at the cabin that evening, Harold stopped by to check on their progress. Marcus told him about finding the adit and the survey markers. "Harold, your grandfather was methodical about his claims. He filed them properly with the county, and they should still be valid if the fees were kept current. You need to go through his papers and find the claim documents. If you have legitimate mineral rights, and if that ore is as good as we thought it was, you might have something significant." "Marcus, but what would I even do with it? I don't know anything about mining." "Harold, first things first, finish the cabin, get through the winter. Then, come spring, we can take proper samples, get them assayed, see what we're really dealing with. If it's worth pursuing, there are small mining operations that might be interested in leasing the rights, or partnering, or even buying it outright. But son, this is the kind of thing that can change your life. It can also destroy it if you're not careful. Greed makes people stupid, and word gets out fast in these mountains." "Marcus, I won't tell anyone, just my dad." "Harold, that's wise. And Marcus, whatever happens with this, remember that your real wealth is what you're building right now. The skills, the strength, the knowledge, those things can't be taken from you." By early December, the cabin was finished. Marcus stood back and looked at his work, barely believing what he'd accomplished. The roof was solid. The walls were tight and well insulated. The stove worked perfectly, warming the space efficiently. He'd even managed to install the salvaged window properly and build a sturdy new door. It wasn't fancy, but it was strong, functional, and would easily see them through the winter. He hiked down to get his father, finding Thomas stronger than he'd been in months, working with a physical therapist in town, slowly regaining mobility. "Thomas, when can I see it?" "Marcus, now if you're up for the hike, I'll help you and we'll take it slow." The trip up took most of the day, with frequent rests. But Thomas was determined. When they finally reached the clearing and he saw the cabin, his face transformed. "Thomas, oh Marcus, son, you did it. You actually did it." They spent that first night together in the cabin, father and son, with Rusty sprawled on the floor between them. Thomas sat in the rocking chair Marcus had repaired, staring into the fire in the wood stove, tears running down his weathered face. "Thomas, your mother would be proud. Hell, I'm proud. I asked too much of you, Marcus, way too much for a 16-year-old kid, but you rose to it. You became a man this fall." "Marcus, Dad, about Grandpa's papers, the ones in those boxes we never went through. I need to look at them. There might be something important there." Over the next week, they settled into the cabin, making it a home. Thomas, feeling stronger and more hopeful than he had in years, began teaching Marcus more advanced woodworking, and they built furniture together, a proper table, chairs, shelves. Marcus told his father about the mineral deposit, and together they went through James Webb's papers until they found the claim documents, mineral surveys, and maps. The documents were legitimate, properly filed, and the annual fees had been maintained through a small automatic payment from a nearly forgotten account James had set up before his death. They owned the mineral rights to 40 acres of mountainside, and somewhere in that claim was a deposit that James Webb had believed was significant. "Thomas, we need to be smart about this. Harold's right. This kind of thing can attract the wrong attention. But if the ore is good, Marcus, this could mean a real future for you. College, trade school, starting a business, whatever you want. This could be the break our family never got." That winter was hard, but manageable. The cabin proved solid against the storms that buried the mountain in snow. They rationed their supplies carefully, and Harold checked on them regularly, always appearing on snowshoes with some small gift, fresh bread, coffee, once even a jar of honey. Marcus turned 17 in January, celebrated quietly with his father and a cake Harold had somehow managed to bake. As he blew out the candles, a single flame from a precious birthday candle they'd saved, Marcus realized how much he'd changed. He barely recognized the scared, desperate boy who'd climbed this mountain in October. In February, they had their first visitor other than Harold, a county surveyor making winter rounds. Thomas, being cautious, mentioned they'd found some old mining claims and wanted to get them properly assessed. The surveyor looked at their documents and whistled. "Surveyor, these are valuable claims, sitting right in an area where we've seen renewed mining interest. Several companies have been exploring around here. If I were you, I'd get a proper geological survey done in spring. Might be worth your while." After the surveyor left, Thomas and Marcus looked at each other with growing excitement tempered by caution. "Thomas, we don't tell anyone else until we know more. Come spring, we'll hire someone legitimate to do testing. But Marcus, this could be it. This could be the thing that gives you choices, a real future." As winter slowly released its grip and March brought the first hints of spring, Harold helped them arrange for a reputable assayer to come up and take samples from the prospect Adait. The professional, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in small-scale mining operations, spent 3 days examining the site, taking core samples and running tests. The wait for her assessment felt endless. Marcus tried to manage his expectations, reminding himself that even if the deposit was real, it might not be economically viable. Mining was expensive, complicated, and heavily regulated. But he couldn't help hoping, couldn't stop imagining what it might mean if his grandfather's decades of work finally paid off. Dr. Chen arrived at the cabin on a cold March morning, her equipment packed on a mule Harold had helped arrange. She was in her 40s, athletic and professional, with the weathered look of someone who spent significant time in the field. "Dr. Chen, so you're the young man who rebuilt this cabin solo. Harold's told me about you. Impressive work." "Marcus, thank you. My dad should be here soon. He's making the hike up slowly." "Dr. Chen, good. You'll both want to hear this together." Thomas arrived an hour later, breathing hard from the climb, but moving better than he had in over a year. The physical therapy combined with hope had worked wonders. He embraced Marcus tightly, then stood back to look at the cabin. "Thomas, son, this is incredible. You did this. You actually did this." "Marcus, we all did. You, me, Harold, even Grandpa through his journal." They gathered inside the warm cabin, Dr. Chen spreading maps and reports on the table Marcus had built. Harold joined them, quiet but attentive. Rusty lay by the stove, as if sensing the importance of the moment. "Dr. Chen, gentlemen, I've completed my assessment of the prospect your grandfather documented. I've taken core samples from multiple locations, analyzed the ore composition, estimated the extent of the mineralization based on his survey work and my own observations. I've also researched current market conditions and extraction costs." She paused, letting the tension build. though Marcus suspected she wasn't doing it intentionally. She was just being thorough. Dr. Chen, what your grandfather found is a high-grade polymetallic deposit, primarily copper and silver, with significant gold content. The grades are exceptional, well above what would typically be considered economic. Based on conservative estimates of the deposit's extent, current metal prices, and accounting for extraction and processing costs, this claim has a net present value in the range of $45 to $48 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus heard his own heartbeat, felt his father's hand grip his shoulder so hard it hurt. Harold made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Thomas, say that again, please. Dr. Chen, your mineral claim is worth approximately $46 million, give or take a few million, depending on actual extent and market fluctuations. It's one of the most significant small-scale discoveries I've assessed in my career. Marcus couldn't process the number. It was too large, too abstract. $46 million. His father was crying, openly and unashamedly. Harold had stood and walked to the window, his back to them, his shoulders shaking. Dr. Chen continued, her voice gentle but professional, explaining their options. They could lease the mineral rights to an established company for a percentage of production. They could sell the claim outright. They could partner with a small mining operation for development. Each option had advantages and risks, financial implications, and legal complexities. Dr. Chen, I can recommend several reputable companies and lawyers who specialize in this area. You'll want good legal counsel before making any decisions. This kind of discovery attracts attention, and not all of it will be welcome. There are people who'd try to take advantage of you, who'd offer unfair terms, or try to contest your claim. You need to protect yourselves. After she left, promising to send detailed reports and contact information, the four of them sat in the cabin in stunned silence. The number seemed unreal, a dream or a mistake. But Dr. Chen had been clear, professional, thorough. This was real. Harold finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Harold, Jimmy knew. He had to have known, at least suspected. All those years, all that work, he knew he was leaving something valuable. He just didn't live long enough to see it developed. Thomas, he left us a legacy, more than just the cabin, more than the land. He left us a future. Marcus felt tears on his face, but wasn't sure when he'd started crying. The weight of the last months, the fear and exhaustion and doubt, suddenly lifted. They'd made it. Not just survived, but actually made it. The cabin was finished, his father was healing, and now this impossible discovery that changed everything. Marcus, what do we do now? Thomas, we think carefully, we get good advice, we make smart decisions. But son, whatever happens with the mine, we've already won. You built this cabin, you saved us. The money is it's just the cherry on top. Marcus, a $46 million cherry. They all laughed then, the tension breaking into something like joy mixed with disbelief. Rusty, sensing the shift in mood, began barking and wagging his tail, demanding attention. Marcus knelt and hugged the dog, burying his face in the copper fur. Marcus, we did it, boy, we actually did it. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Thomas navigated the complex world of mineral rights and mining law. They hired a lawyer Harold recommended, a woman from Denver who specialized in small-scale mining claims. They met with several companies interested in developing the deposit. They learned about environmental regulations, extraction methods, profit-sharing arrangements. It was overwhelming and exciting and terrifying all at once, but through it all, they stayed grounded in what Harold and Dr. Chen had emphasized. Make no hasty decisions. Understand every term before signing anything. Remember that their leverage was time, the deposit wasn't going anywhere, and neither were they. Eventually, they agreed to a partnership with a mid-sized mining company that specialized in environmentally responsible extraction. The terms included a substantial upfront payment for development rights, ongoing royalties based on production, and strict environmental protections for the land. The lawyers reviewed everything multiple times. The contracts were signed in April, with the first payment coming through in May. When the money finally appeared in their bank account, Thomas sat staring at the statement for a full 10 minutes without speaking. "Thomas, it's real. It's actually real." "Marcus, what do we do with it?" "Thomas, first, we make sure you finish school. Not traditional school necessarily, but education, whatever you want to study, wherever you want to go. Second, I get the surgery I need, fix my back properly. Third, we set up funds to maintain the cabin and the land. And fourth, we figure out how to use this to help people, the way Harold helped you, the way your grandfather would have wanted." They created the James Webb Memorial Scholarship for rural students pursuing trades or technical education. They ensured Harold was comfortable and secure for the rest of his life. They improved the cabin while maintaining its character, adding solar panels and modern insulation, but keeping the fundamental structure Marcus had restored. They bought a better truck and winterized the old logging road so access was easier. But the biggest change was internal. Marcus no longer felt trapped by circumstance, defined by poverty and limitation. He'd learned that he was capable of far more than he'd imagined, that strength came not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them. The mountain had tested him and taught him, and he'd emerged transformed. On Marcus's 18th birthday, he and his father hiked up to the Prospect Edit, now secured and marked with proper safety signage as the mining company began initial development work. They stood at the entrance, looking out over the vast expanse of mountains stretching to the horizon. "Thomas, do you ever regret it, that fall, all that work, how hard it was?" "Marcus, no. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. It made me who I am." "Thomas, what do you want to do now? You've got choices, opportunities. You could go anywhere, do anything." Marcus looked around at the mountains, the forests, the endless sky. He thought about that desperate, frightened boy who'd first climbed this trail, unsure if he could make it through a single night. He thought about the lessons learned, the strength discovered, the man he'd become. "Marcus, I want to stay. Not forever, maybe. I want to travel, see things, learn more. But this is home. Grandpa built something here, and we're building on it. There's value in that, in staying connected to where you came from, in honoring what came before while creating something new." "Thomas, your grandfather would be proud of that answer. Hell, I'm proud of that answer." Rusty barked, chasing a squirrel through the clearing, his copper coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. The dog had been with Marcus through it all, a constant companion, a source of comfort and courage. Marcus whistled, and Rusty came bounding back, tail wagging, ready for whatever came next. As they walked back to the cabin through the forest they knew so well, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had started with desperation, with his father's stark words echoing in the cold morning air. "We'll freeze here, son." Those words had pushed Marcus out of his comfort zone, forced him to discover resources within himself he hadn't known existed. The cabin that had seemed like an impossible task was now their home, solid and warm. The mine that his grandfather had worked so hard to document was now yielding its treasure, not through luck, but through careful preservation of knowledge and patient investigation. The scared boy had become a confident young man, not through magic or sudden transformation, but through the slow accumulation of skills, experience, and self-knowledge. That evening, as the three of them sat on the cabin's porch watching the sun set, Harold joined them, as he often did. The old man had become family, the grandfather Marcus had never known, the mentor who'd appeared exactly when needed. "Harold, you know, Jimmy used to sit right here on summer evenings, planning his next exploration, dreaming his dreams. He'd be pleased to see his grandson sitting in the same spot, having accomplished what he started. Marcus, do you think he knew about the real value of what he'd found? Harold, I think he suspected. But for Jimmy, the value wasn't really in the minerals. It was in the life he'd built, the independence, the connection to the land. The money was always secondary. I think he'd be more proud of the fact that you rebuilt this cabin, that you learned to survive and thrive up here, than he would be about the mining claim. Marcus, that's the strange part. The cabin taught me everything. The mine is just, I don't know, a bonus. The real wealth was in the work itself, in discovering I could do hard things. Thomas, that's wisdom talking. Most people spend their whole lives chasing the bonus, never realizing the real prize is in who they become along the way. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they sat in comfortable silence, four beings connected by circumstance and choice, a father, a son, a dog, and an old mountain man who'd become family. The cabin behind them stood solid against the night, a testament to persistence and skill, built with the same hands that had once trembled with fear and doubt. Marcus thought about where he'd been a year ago, trapped in a failing trailer, watching his father decline, seeing no future beyond survival. Now he sat in a home he'd built with his own hands, on land that held both historical meaning and future promise, with skills and knowledge that would serve him for life. The journey from that frightened boy to this confident young man hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. The mountain had called him, challenged him, tested him, and ultimately rewarded him. But the reward wasn't really the money or the mine. It was the knowledge that he could face the impossible and find a way through. It was the relationship deepened with his father, built through shared struggle and ultimate triumph. It was the friendship with Harold, a connection across generations that enriched both their lives. It was the simple pleasure of sitting on a porch he'd built, watching stars emerge over mountains he'd learned to call home. Marcus, Dad, do you remember what you said that morning when you told me about the cabin? Thomas, I said a lot of things that morning. Marcus, you said I had strong hands and a good head on my shoulders. You said I could do it. I don't think I believed you then. Thomas, but you did it anyway. That's courage, son. Doing the thing you're afraid of, the thing you're not sure you can accomplish. Most people never find that kind of courage. You found it at 16. The conversation drifted to plans for the coming year, to Marcus's studies, to the ongoing development of the mine, to improvements they wanted to make to the cabin. But underneath it all was a sense of contentment, of having weathered the storm and found calmer waters. As the night grew colder and they prepared to go inside, Marcus took one last look at the clearing, the cabin, the mountains beyond. This place that had seemed like a desperate last resort had become home. The challenge that had seemed impossible had become the foundation of his new life. The fear that had nearly paralyzed him had been transformed into confidence. Rusty stretched and yawned, ready for sleep. Harold said his good nights and headed back to his own cabin, his flashlight bobbing through the trees. Thomas went inside to bank the fire for the night, and Marcus stood alone on the porch for a moment longer, breathing the cold mountain air, feeling the solid wood beneath his feet, wood he'd shaped and placed with his own hands. "We'll freeze here, son." Those words that had started everything, spoken in desperation and fear, now seemed like words from another lifetime, spoken to a different person. They hadn't frozen. They'd survived, thrived, and built something lasting. The cabin stood as proof that with determination, guidance, and courage, even the most daunting challenges could be overcome. Marcus went inside, closing the solid door behind him. The cabin was warm, the stove radiating heat, everything in its place. Outside, the mountain stood eternal and indifferent, as it had for millennia. But within these log walls, a boy had become a man, a family had found stability, and a grandfather's legacy had finally borne fruit. The journey that had begun with fear and desperation had ended with confidence and possibility. And while the mine would provide financial security, Marcus knew the real treasure had been found long before the first ore sample was assayed. It had been found in every log lifted into place, every skill learned, every night survived, every moment of doubt overcome. The real treasure was the transformation itself, the discovery that within him lay reserves of strength, resilience, and capability he'd never suspected. As he settled into his bunk with Rusty at his feet and his father snoring softly on the other side of the room, Marcus smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new lessons to learn. But tonight, he rested in the cabin he'd built, surrounded by love and accomplishment, secure in the knowledge that whatever came next, he could handle it. The mountain had taught him well, and the story that had begun with a frightened boy and his dog facing an impossible task had become the story of a young man who discovered his strength, honored his heritage, and built a future on the solid foundation of his own competence and courage. The cabin stood as testimony, the mine as opportunity, but the real legacy was the man Marcus had become, forged in the fire of challenge and proven against the mountain's test. "We'll freeze here, son." The words that had once terrified now inspired. They'd faced the winter and won. They'd faced the mountain and thrived. And now, as sleep claimed him, Marcus knew with certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready. The boy who'd climbed the mountain in fear had descended in strength, and the man who remained had found his home, his purpose, and his power. The fire in the stove burned low but steady, keeping the cold at bay. The cabin, built with patience and skill, sheltered them from the mountain's harsh indifference. And somewhere in the rock face above, minerals that had waited millions of years to be discovered would soon yield their treasure. But the greatest treasure had already been claimed, forged in the crucible of challenge, proven through the work of determined hands, and kept safe in the heart of a young man who'd learned that he was capable of far more than he'd ever dared to imagine. The mountain stood silent in the darkness, keeping its secrets, offering its challenges, rewarding those brave enough to accept its tests. And in the cabin on the ridge, 3 souls slept peacefully, secure in their shelter, confident in their strength, and ready for whatever tomorrow might bring.